Warm welcome to the History Show here on Uxbridge FM. And we're welcoming back, of course, Ken Pearce, who's chairman of the Uxbridge Local History Society. This talk is entitled Some Unusual Happenings. Ken.
Thank you. Right. Yes. Well, my first incident comes from Denham and the parish church of St Mary, where in the 1960s a section of the wooden floor became unsafe. So it was decided, of course, that that part of the church floor would have to be replaced. The workmen arrived, started to take up the old floor, only to discover that below it was a vault, a sort of chamber containing about 8 coffins, which had originally been covered in red velvet, although they were very grubby by this time. And plates on the coffins revealed that they were all members of the Peckham family. Now, this takes us right back to the time of Henry VIII, when the Peckham family were lords of the manor of Denham. But on top of one of the coffins was a small and rather ornate wooden box. And in the course of time, it had fallen apart. And inside, there was a black, rather shriveled object about the size of a lemon. Whatever could it be? Well, they called in the local historian at that time, Colin Measurer, who knew instantly what it must be. One of the members of the Peckham family, Sir Robert Peckham, didn't like the fact that Henry VIII had broken with Rome and set up his own Church of England. Robert was a devout Catholic, and he had no wish to abandon his ideas and beliefs. So he simply set off to Rome and lived there for the rest of his life. When he became seriously ill, he left a request that although his heart should be buried in Rome, his body should be buried in Rome, his heart should be sent back to Denham. And that's what it was. In that broken wooden box was a 400-year-old heart. Now, the workmen wanted to get on and replace the floor, of course, but everybody felt, well, you can't just leave it like that, you know. We ought to put the heart into something. So they went down to the local shop, and all they could find was a plastic butter dish. So Robert Peckham's heart was put in the butter dish, back on top of the coffin, and the new floor was completed. Somebody, one day, perhaps in a few centuries' time, is going to come across this ancient heart in a plastic butter dish. My next story is of a most unusual will. Just to introduce it, can I tell you that one of my cousins had a deal of trouble not so long ago when her husband died. Now, he'd made a will, he got it signed and witnessed, but he just forgot to put the date on. And would you believe it, that caused a lot of delay and extra expense. My story is of a will that was shouted out of a window and accepted as legal. Memorandum that on Sunday the 7th of May or thereabouts, 1609, Joan Robinson, late wife of Thomas Robinson of Uxbridge in the county of Middlesex, deceased, being sick of the plague and of good and perfect memory, did make and declare her last will in manner and form following. She looked out of the window of her house in Uxbridge and said to Agnes Giles, wife of William Giles, dwelling in Fleet Lane, London, she being then in the street in Uxbridge, thus or so in effect: Here, Nan, I give unto you all that I have. And then threw out her keys to the said Agnes and said, Look unto it, it is all thine, saving I give to Bessie Cripps, my husband's cousin, half a dozen napkins, a pair of sheets, and a handkerchief. To her father I give my husband's best suit, and to my husband's sister I give my gown, a hat, and a smock. And to my maid Isabel I give my petticoat and some of my workaday clothes besides. Then, being present in the said street and hearing these things, were William Day, Elizabeth Day his wife, John Curtin, Julian Tanner, and many others. That, I'm sure, is a most unusual will. Shouted out of a window, but accepted as legal. Obviously, the poor soul was suffering the plague, and nobody wanted to go near her, which is why this non-cupative will was accepted. A non-cupative will is one where the writer is unable to sign, unable to write for some reason or other. And so you can still get a non-cupative will today. Take one example: if someone has lost both hands, well, they're totally incapable of signing. Moving on, the weather is also subject for conversation. And so we have here from a news sheet, not a newspaper, a news sheet issued in London in 1738, some unusual weather in Uxbridge. And this is how it reads. Of the many melancholy accounts which have been at any time received from the different parts of this kingdom, of damages done by thunder and lightning, none can surpass the following relation, which may be depended upon as true and authentic. At Uxbridge in the county of Middlesex, about 15 miles from London, on Tuesday the 15th day of July 1738, there happened one of the most dreadful storms of hail, thunder, and lightning that has been known in any part of the kingdom in the memory of the oldest man living. The storm began much about 1 o'clock in the afternoon with a slight shower of rain, followed by some flashes of lightning, which increased prodigiously in less than half an hour's time, insomuch that the whole sky appeared as if on fire. However, the lightning ceased a little, and a great many labouring people at harvest work, who had left the fields and come into the town to shelter, thinking the storm pretty well over, went back to work again. But in a very short time the lightning increased, and such a shower of hail fell that some of the hailstones measured 12 inches round. Everybody in the town and neighbourhood were in the utmost consternation, especially the people working in the fields, many of whom were knocked down by the force of the hailstones, and so hurt that they have not since been able to work or even get out of bed. It is said that 2 ancient men are dead, and lives of others in great danger. The cattle who were grazing in the fields, oxen and cows, as well as sheep, lambs, etc., suffered very much. And the fields were in a manner covered with the bodies of dead birds, especially in such places where there were trees to which these feathered animals had fled for shelter. But nothing could scarcely resist the fury of this violent storm. Many trees were lopped of their branches in a manner surprising to the eye of the beholders. Abundance of poultry was also killed before they could shelter themselves in the barns or otherwise. Almost all the windows in the town were broken or shattered to pieces, besides other damages done to the houses. And what damages have been sustained in the fields are almost incredible, for the gardeners alone have suffered incredibly, to the amount of several £100 by the fruit that has been destroyed and the glass that has been broken. One sufferer is Mr. Mills, a gardener near the Crown Inn, whose damage amounts to over £50. Besides all this, it is said that a gentleman and his servant, who were riding into Buckinghamshire, were flung from their horses, that the gentleman was taken up for dead, and the man burnt terribly by the lightning, but we cannot affirm this for fact. The storm did no damage but within half a mile of Uxbridge, and while it continued, the air was as cold as if in the middle of winter, and continued so for some time after the storm was over. Many people will no doubt take this story to be without any foundation. But if they give themselves the trouble of inquiring at the inns in Holborn, where the coaches and carriages go to Uxbridge, it will be found too true. For were the melancholy particulars of the terrible havoc made by this dreadful storm to be published, they would appear so dismal as scarcely to be credited by the reader. Well, just a word about the hailstones, measuring 12 inches round. Now, that means the circumference of the hailstone would have been 12 inches, not the diameter. But nevertheless, they would have been very large, virtually the size of a large orange, I would think. And they could do serious damage, as we've heard. And the other thing I feel bound to comment on is the fact that Uxbridge was clearly a small agricultural community in those days. And that shows up very clearly from the outcome. Some time ago, I had a chance to look at one of the baptismal registers at St Mary's Church in Hayes from the middle of the 18th century. And I was interested to discover some entries in the back of the register, which were not baptisms at all, but just a record of events that took place. It would appear that the rector of Hayes at the time was very friendly with the Reverend Charles Wesley and also his brother John. Now, at this period, John and Charles Wesley were still clergy of the Church of England. Later, they were to break away and, of course, found the Methodist Church. But at this period, they were still Anglicans and preaching in Anglican churches. Now, their friendship with the vicar meant that they often preached at Hayes. 17th of January 1749. The Reverend Charles Wesley preached at Hayes to a serious and well-behaved congregation. And then comes the text in St Mark's Gospel from which he preached. 5th of February 1749, the Reverend John Wesley preached here to an attentive audience morning and afternoon. 4th of February 1750, the Reverend John Wesley preached to a crowded audience. Now, one would get the impression from that things were doing well at St Mary's Hayes in those days. But oddly enough, also entered in this particular register were other entries that gave an entirely different picture, especially when the vicar himself was preaching, apparently. 11th of February 1750, the company of singers, by consent of the ordinary, were forbidden to sing any more by the minister on account of their frequent ill behaviour in the chancel, and their ordering the carpenter to pull down part of the belfry in order to erect a gallery without permission from the minister and church wardens. 18th of March 1750. The clerk announced the 100th psalm. The singers immediately opposed him and sang the 15th and bred a disturbance. 19th of February 1750. Being Shrove Tuesday, we had prayers and a sermon in the afternoon, by which, by the blessing of God, entirely prevented the throwing at cocks. This was a terrible old custom where a cockerel was brought into the churchyard and people just threw stones at it until it was dead. Fortunately, it didn't happen on that occasion. 10th of April 1751. This Wednesday in the evening, William Blackall came late into the church while the psalm was being sung, with pipe in mouth and pot of beer in his hand, and he stayed all time the sermon in his own pew, behaving indecently to mention. 5th of November 1751. From the time I began prayers to almost the end of the sermon, the bell ringers and other inhabitants, with John Millard, Nathiel Brown and John Weston, ceased not to endeavour to disturb us by ringing the bells, making other noises, and spitting from the belfry upon the people's heads as they sat in their pews. Well, as you can see, although there were orderly occasions when the Wesley brothers were preaching, that was far from true on other occasions. An entry from the church register in Cowley caught my eye. February the 4th, 1840, old Mr. Wareham was buried in the same grave from which his wife, some 12 years since, had been taken up by body snatchers. Now, that's the only occasion that I've come across of body snatching going on in our area. It was widespread in London, and the bodies were sold to medical students normally to practice, but there wasn't much demand, I think, in the Uxbridge area. Nevertheless, there was this one occasion where a body was snatched from a grave in Cowley. In 1902, an accident took place on the railway at Northolt, where a new railway was being built from Paddington through to the Midlands by the Great Western Railway and also jointly by the Great Central Railway. Now, unfortunately, Richard Pilkington was working on the line and he was hit by a train and killed at the age of 43. I found his gravestone in Hillingdon Cemetery with the following poem. My engine now is cold and still, no water does my boiler fill. My coal affords its flames no more, my days of usefulness are o'er. My wheels deny their noted speed, no more my guiding hand they need. My whistle too has lost its tone, its shrill and thrilling sounds are gone. My valves are now thrown open wide, my flanges will refuse to guide. My clacks also, though once so strong, refuse to aid the busy throng. No more I feel each urging breath, life's railway o'er, each station past, in death I'm stopped, and rest at last. Farewell, dear friends, and cease to weep. In Christ I'm safe, in him I sleep. My last unusual story reminds me that the local paper is not what it used to be. At one time, you've got every issue contained births, engagements, marriages, funerals, anniversaries, in memoriam notices in particular. Now, well, you have to search very hard to find anything at all. In memoriam notices were something I used to enjoy, mostly because, and I hope I'm not being unkind, mostly because when people's relatives died, they felt moved to write a poem of some sort. And most of these verses were absolutely dreadful. However, there's one that sticks in my mind from the 1950s, and I'll finish with this. The verse read, "He went without a warning, he went without a sigh, and now he's gone to heaven, and God alone knows why."
Thanks, Ken. Wonderful as ever. A nice selection of stories there, from hearts in butter dishes to wheels shattered out of windows, large hailstones, and then gravestones. That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah. Right. I guess we'll rendezvous again next month. It'll be warmer, hopefully.
Well, I hope I can come to you, perhaps.
Ah, yes, that would be great, in the studio. Yes.